In 1809, by 1809, John Quincy Adams was the most sophisticated and renowned diplomat that America had. And the day after his inauguration, the very next day, President Madison calls him into his office and all of a sudden says, I want you as a diplomat, and you're going to St. Petersburg.
Hello and welcome to Stand Up Historian. This is our second episode on our series with my good friend, historian and technologist, Alexei Palladin. We are going to call you Al, like the first episode. And in this episode, we are going to talk about the War of 1812 between Great Britain and United States. You know, at that time, there was Alexander I in Russia, George III in Britain, and also that's it, right?
And Napoleon.
Napoleon. Yes. Napoleon.
Oh, yes.
And this was the Napoleonic Wars,
yes.
Actually.
Oh, yes.
So we are going to listen to Al and see what was the role of Russia in that war and how they could, by the role they played, support Americans, which they called that war Second Independence War, if I'm not mistaken, right? Would you like to say something to our audience? And then,
Kurosh, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me back so soon.
Course.
I did not anticipate that it would be less than a week since our first recording. Yeah. And to the thousands and thousands of viewers who have already seen this, thanks to your channel, Kurosh, thank you. Thank you for the interest in the subject matter. And it was actually suggested by one of the viewers that we focus on the War of 1812, or the Wars of 1812, on two hemispheres.
Perfect.
And we'll talk about how they are interconnected, if that's
absolutely.
Okay.
I'm all ears.
Well, thank you very much. And let's go back a little bit before 1812. We're going to go back to the times of Catherine the Great, which was our previous episode, and talk specifically about diplomacy and relationships. As we established, Catherine the Great, in essence, enabled regime change in America.
Absolutely.
From the background, but very actively, as we talked about. And she was also the one that was proactive in establishing ties, relationships with the United States from a diplomatic perspective. It is recorded that in 1779, she told her foreign affairs ministry to reach out to the American ambassador in Paris, in France. And that was, of course, Benjamin Franklin. And that was done, and that was to enable commerce. Catherine was very interested about trade routes and charts and how, both from the Atlantic side of things, but also from the Pacific side of things, things could go more smoothly. Of course, Benjamin Franklin responded, and when the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, as he put it, he saw it as my duty to deliver a copy of the actual peace treaty to Catherine the Great. He didn't do so in person, but it was delivered to the Russian court. From that point, Catherine actually exchanged letters with President Washington. It was a curiosity that she held throughout her life. That particular curiosity was with the affairs of the native tribes of America. She was putting together one of the first international dictionaries, and she was asking President Washington for some words that he could input. And they also had a discourse about trade and other things.
And this dictionary was for Native Americans or the English American Russian?
It was for a Russian understanding of the world.
Okay.
She was asking for input from all the nationalities that she could reach so that it would be more of a universal dictionary.
Okay.
Of course, we have Google Translate these days and other sources.
For sure.
But back in the day, it was, of course, books. Right?
Yes.
Books like these. And she was one of those that was trying to put together tomes and tomes to enable international dialogue. And that's what actually President Washington picked up on. As he wrote back, he said, I look forward to seeing this enable better relations, not only between our country, but mutual understanding.
Yeah.
So with President Washington, the trade that started between America and Russia continued, and so did diplomacy. It's interesting how the founding fathers played multiple roles. And Thomas Jefferson, of course, served as ambassador, right? He
Yeah.
joined Franklin,
Yes.
and he also joined Adams in Europe. And as he was preparing for his ambassadorship, he had access to the secret book of foreign affairs that was maintained by the Continental Congress. So basically, the main letters describing the relations,
Yes.
the treaties, and also the discourse that they had amongst themselves in terms of what they wanted to achieve. So when Thomas Jefferson arrived in Europe, he already knew a lot about Russia. And from that position, he actually helped Russia after the Revolutionary War was done in a very direct way. There was a famous character that led to the creation of the United States Navy. And he found himself to be unemployed at that point in time. So Thomas Jefferson was, of course, familiar with Russia's needs, but also he came across an interesting character in Paris, John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones, who was a Scotsman by birth, became an American by faith and belief, and he led to the establishment of the United States Navy. Now, after the Revolutionary War was done, he was out of a job, unemployed.
Yes.
So Mr. Jefferson introduced him to the Russian ambassador, which led to the fact that John Paul Jones showed up in St. Petersburg and was greeted by Catherine the Great. The Continental Congress authorized them to go and seek employment. And not only that, he carried a copy of the new U.S. Constitution.
Oh, wow.
Catherine was grateful. She accepted the copy of the Constitution and told Captain Jones that you will find a great role in the Russian Navy. We need you. And you were captain for the Americans. You'll be admiral in the Russian Navy. Which he did. And he served on the Black Sea. And he served alongside, actually, with the legendary General Alexander Suvorov. And together they won a number of battles.
You introduced them in our previous conversation.
The same Suvorov that King George wanted to send to America, but Catherine refused.
Yes.
And she kept him out of that fight.
Yes.
But here they actually developed a fabulous friendship, and both left behind their memoirs reflecting on the character of each other. They really appreciated the heroism, but also the professionalism. Suvorov on land and John Paul Jones on sea under the Russian imperial flag. Interesting quirk. But back to the founding fathers and what they knew and that continuation. So the first contacts with Catherine the Great and Franklin, Washington, and Jefferson. But very soon, the contacts started evolving into a desire to establish an embassy. And as we talked in the previous episode, it was John Adams who recommended that a delegation be sent with Francis Dana and the very young 13-year-old John Quincy Adams. John Quincy only spent a year in 1781 in St. Petersburg and then came back. Little did anybody know that very soon, relatively soon, he would be back in Russia as the first full-fledged ambassador. And that is very significant for the events of 1812 and how John Quincy Adams shaped relationships between the nation. But between then and 1812, we go back to about 1800. At that point in time, President Washington and then President John Adams, trade continues to grow. And it grows to such an extent that if you look at some of the reports coming in from the U.S. East Coast, Massachusetts, New England, and such, it was said that most of the new American ships were built with Russian sails, Russian tackle, and Russian nails. Most of the houses in New England at the time were also built using Russian nails. Back to the ships, there were so many of them that were using Russian gear that they were actually called Russiamen on the sea. Russiamen. That was the common term for them. And the preference for Russian products was actually recorded in some of the documents left behind by the First Lady of the United States, Abigail Adams. She wrote that she had a preference, or she actually placed an order for some Russian bed sheeting and some Russian towels and such. Now, part of it was that the goods themselves were of good quality. The other aspect was that America was experiencing a blockade, an embargo.
Yes.
The British, although they lost the war and they sort of settled things with the colonies, they did not abandon their ambition to economically control America and place a chokehold. So Americans had to resort to other suppliers, and Russian supply was quite welcome. So, of course, after President Adams, our next president, the third president of the United States, was Thomas Jefferson. By the time he became president, he had actually served as Secretary of State, again, all foreign relations. He also served as vice president for John Adams. And during this time, he knew a great deal about Russia. But when he came into office in March of 1801, it was a curious set of things that happened in the United States and in Russia in a matter of days. So Jefferson was inaugurated, of course, on March 4th of 1801, the peaceful transfer of power. In Russia, things were not so peaceful. 20 days later, approximately 20 days later, the father of Alexander I was assassinated.
Yes.
It was a coup. Now, when we come to the history of Paul I and the United States, it was actually a happy history. It was a continuation from the time of Catherine. Paul regarded the United States as an opportunity, both from the Atlantic with all the trade, but also from the Pacific. Paul was the one who authorized the creation of the Russian-American Company, the monopoly to rule Alaska, to develop Alaska, to extend the fur trade. And that was important because Thomas Jefferson, as Secretary of State, in his very first white paper that he produced for President Washington in terms of world events and potential wars with Britain and Spain at that time, he actually reflected on the Russians. He said, we must take into account that the fur trade is dependent on American commerce. It was actually American ships that were taking Russian fur to Asia, to China, to those marketplaces very, very successfully. So back to 1801. Thomas Jefferson thinks that he will be dealing with Paul I. Paul I had actually shown himself very well in 1797 during the so-called XYZ affair. Now, people tend to sometimes forget or not know that after the Revolutionary War, America found itself in a number of potential conflicts. And one of them was the XYZ affair. 1797, it was against France, who had been an ally just a few years back. And France had quite a few ambitions in the territories that are now known as the United States. It was so bad that President Adams reached out to a retired president and General George Washington and said, we will probably have to recall you from your rest to come lead our troops in the battlefield. Paul from Russia responded by doing a number of things, including declaring a second armed neutrality. Remember we talked about the armed neutrality with Catherine?
Yes.
He did basically the same to send a message to the French this time, and the message worked. Paul, unfortunately, was a very unstable person. He had mental health issues. And although he proclaimed certain things, he did not see them through. And he irritated a number of people in the Russian government and the noblesse. One thing that he did do, which was good, was he did give orders to start establishing an embassy from Russia to the United States. But the things that he did not do irritated quite a few. And in March of 1801, there was a coup. 12 officers and high-ranking officials, after a lot of liquid courage, after a night of drinking, they came to the palace, they came to his bedchamber, and they first wanted him to abdicate. He resisted, he put up a fight, and he was actually killed by chance. Remember we talked about Russians and tobacco and some of that addiction?
Yes.
In a turn of events, and Paul I was also a tobacco user, but it was not his tobacco snuff box. One of the assailants who was trying to force Paul to sit at a table and to sign the letter of abdication that they brought for him, and he was resisting. He actually put up a fight. He took out his snuff box and he whacked him in the left temple, after which blood, loss of consciousness, and the rest of them decided to finish him off. It is said that did not happen without British influence, actually.
Ah,
It's very interesting that the final official report was signed by a physician that was Scottish born. And the official cause of death was a stroke.
stroke.
For the longest time, the Romanov dynasty and others, they hid the fact that it was actually a coup and an assassination. But Alexander I, interestingly enough, he knew about it because his father had very difficult relationships with him and his brother and the other children. And actually, for a time, Alexander I was under arrest. So by happenstance, he became emperor of Russia a few days after Thomas Jefferson became president of the United
At
States.
a very young age, right? How old was he when?
Oh,
Do you remember?
he was in his 20s.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't remember the exact age
Yeah,
at
but
that point in time. But
the young
actually,
czar.
Jefferson reflected on that because very soon after Alexander came to power, they actually started exchanging letters. And it wasn't just because of the official affairs. Thomas Jefferson took an interest in the young Tsar because it was Alexander who had reached out to the US president first. And here's how it happened. Alexander was very different from his father. And Catherine, who had a very difficult relationship with her son, Paul, she actually wanted to skip a generation. And she made it public, which irritated Paul to no end.
So she meant to go to Alexander.
Absolutely.
Oh,
She
okay.
basically almost appropriated him from birth. Alexander was known as the Golden Prince, not just because of all the wealth of the empire, but he was blonde and tall and a good-looking guy. But he was raised basically by Catherine. She told Paul, hands off, I'm responsible for this young man. And Alexander was raised in a very Spartan style. He slept in an army cot. Even in the winter, the windows were wide open, so you would have some fresh air. He was very independent and also bright. And his outlook and vision of the world was shaped by somebody that Catherine got for him. And here we must reflect on how complex Catherine was.
Please.
On the one hand,
Yeah.
she was a monarch, and people called her a despot. And of course, she was famously against the French Revolution when that happened. But she got Alexander a mentor that came from Europe, came from Switzerland. His name was Frédéric César de la Harpe. And de la Harpe was a scholar, but also Republican. Years later, he would go back to his home of Switzerland and be a founding father of a republic there, where they created a two-chamber parliament. They had a constitution.
Yeah.
But while Alexander was young, he was his mentor. He was his tutor. He was teaching him not only French, but also this outlook in life. So Alexander had the benefit of a European education with an understanding, a vision of how Europe was evolving and also America. And Alexander knew that de la Harpe had contacts with the Americans, and he said, could you put me in touch with President Jefferson? And that's how it started.
Very interesting. Very interesting. This conversation, the part that I love is these little nuances and stories that nobody has talked about these things. Now you're introducing a new character in that historical time frame, Alexander I. We know more about it, I believe, from this short conversation so far, than if you start reading something about wars of 1812 and just going over every character that was on the international scene and played a role in that. Thank you. Okay. I have the Alexander first.
I appreciate that comment, but that was intentional to give you sort of a feel, our audience a feel for who he was as a leader. He was very different from his predecessors. In a way, he was continuing the line. Okay, so by this point in time, Russia and America already have trade and a form of diplomatic relations. But now he's reaching out. And his intention of outreach to Thomas Jefferson is very clear. He puts it as, I want to get into direct contact, direct touch with the founding father. I want to learn what was in his mind when he designed this new country.
Exactly. That's an amazing part of history. You creating a new nation, a new country.
And
What an experience.
Alexander was fascinated.
Yeah.
And he started envisioning a new Russia. He envisioned a Russia that would have a constitution, revolutionary. Now, whether he got there or not, that's a different story.
Sure.
But what he definitely did do was liberate Russia in so many ways. For example, he did away with censorship. Book publishing rose to unprecedented volumes.
Freedom of press.
Freedom of press, freedom of expression. Now, there was a little bit of oversight,
of course,
but he encouraged people to learn about the world and to have more frank conversations in society. In terms of what he wanted to learn himself and his exchange with Thomas Jefferson, he was asking for specific things. He asked for a copy of the Constitution. And oh, by the way, Alexander not only spoke French, which was the language at the court, he spoke English. He was taught to understand English, and later he would actually practice it. We're going to get there in a second. So Alexander was very well versed, and that made such an impression on Jefferson that Jefferson remarked a number of times that we are basically blessed that that nation over there is now having somebody young, open-minded, reaching out to us and paying attention to us in our infancy. Jefferson understood where the United States stood, and it was
the choice of word there, the infancy of the United States.
Oh, yes. Not my words. It was actually Jefferson's and the founding fathers. They understood where they were.
Yeah.
What they also understood was something that John Quincy Adams later captured many, many years later, after the War of 1812. And I promise we'll get there in a second. But the fact of the matter was that for 50 years, from the Revolutionary War, 50 years onward, Russia was the only ally that the United States had in Europe, only consistent ally. Now, of course, France and Spain helped, but then XYZ affair, 1797, Napoleon, we're going to talk about what he did to the United States in a second. Russia remained constant, and the United States could count on Russia. In what way? Very soon, Thomas Jefferson had a number of issues that he was dealing with. One was actually trade-related, but didn't have anything to do with Britain and France. It had everything to do with pirates.
Pirates, yes.
Pirates from Tripoli. Yes. Remember those guys in history, right? Yes. The Mediterranean. Yes. American ships were captured. American captains and American sailors were enslaved. They were traded. Bounties were set. Messages were sent from Tripoli to the United States, asking that the United States pay for the heads of their own subjects. And that enraged Jefferson. And of course, we know about the history of the United States Marine Corps and all that.
Letternecks. And
what people tend to forget is that Russia played an active role. There were a number of incidents where Russia used its navy and also its diplomatic stance with the Ottoman Empire to influence the pirates to release people, ships, and goods. And Thomas Jefferson was thrilled. He wrote to Alexander I with a letter of thanks and saying, oh, if we can provide the same for you, for your merchant fleet and such. To which Alexander responded, I wish I had a merchant fleet. That was his problem. He had a navy.
Yeah, but not a merchant fleet.
Not a merchant fleet. And of course, this is interesting because this has been the bane of Russia's. And any state that is being dominated by a central command and control system, they're usually good at building foundations. They're usually good at building up a military. But if they restrict entrepreneurship, as we know, nothing happens.
Nothing happens. No growth.
And Alexander realized this as he was taking over the Russian Empire. When he saw Jefferson's letter, he said, well, what merchant fleet? I don't have one. To which he used that as an opportunity. And as he sent his first ambassador to D.C., proper envoy, Andrei Dashkov, Dashkov's orders were ask the president. And by that time, we're moving from Jefferson to President Madison. Ask the president if he can help us with more trade on American ships. We'd be glad to. We'd be glad to continue to sell. We'd be glad to continue to buy more products from the United States. At that time, about 2/3 of all sugar imported into Russia was actually American. Of course, tobacco and other products. Russia sent more industrial goods to America. And the Americans were grateful to receive that because, again, why? The British and the embargoes and such.
Yes.
They also wanted to have direct trade because sometimes American ships, they were forced to land in ports such as British ports and also French ports, Spanish ports, unload their goods, and then the goods would pass through middlemen, and each middleman adds their surcharge and the cost of goods and tariffs and customs and so on and so forth, which made American goods uncompetitive in the European marketplace. And when Ambassador Madison met with the Russian envoy, that was one of the points of consideration, conversation of, can we build more of a flow? The other thing that America was dealing with, and this is 1809, was the fact that Napoleon became not only assertive, but he was becoming dominant in Europe.
Yes.
Napoleon had actually defeated Russia and Prussia and Austria in the wars of 1805, 1806, and 1807. Alexander met with Napoleon at Tilsit, where Napoleon forced Alexander to sign a treaty, which made Alexander an enemy of the British, an ally of the French, but also responsible to adhere to the so-called continental system. So what was that? Napoleon wanted to gain control over all of Europe by controlling all of commerce. All ships needed to land in ports controlled by the French. And then the French would decide what tariffs and duties and such to charge, and who got what, or who did not get anything. What we tend to forget is that the continental system, although was designed primarily to block British trade and influence the British, it actually had a side effect on America. And that's what President Madison mentioned to Ambassador Dashkov. He said, if only we could find a route so that our goods can land in Russia and then from Russia flow into Europe. Mm-hmm. Can you please help us? And much to everybody's surprise, Alexander I did. He did so because of a relationship. And here we go back to John Quincy Adams. Mm-hmm. In 1809, by 1809, John Quincy Adams was the most sophisticated and renowned diplomat that America had. And the day after his inauguration, the very next day, President Madison calls him into his office and all of a sudden says, I want you as a diplomat, and you're going to St. Petersburg. And you have half an hour to the side because I'm meeting with Congress and I want to put you up your nomination. John Quincy Adams thought about it for a couple of minutes and said, I see no reason not to. Please nominate me, sir. Yeah. So the most senior diplomat that America had was being sent not to London, not to Paris, not to another, he was being sent to St. Petersburg. Another indicator of the importance of the relationship as perceived by the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, who of course backed him up. John Quincy Adams arrived for the second time in his life in St. Petersburg in 1809. And first time he was there for a year. This time he would stay, as President Madison put it, indefinitely. Okay. There was no limit, but it turned out to be 5 years. 5 years of his life, a total of 6 years amongst the Russians.
They spent in Russia.
Yes.